Hello, everybody, and thanks for watching or listening. I was really excited to be part of this project. We're reading FotL by Vilhjalmar Stefansson. Different people are doing different chapters. I'm starting with chapter 1 here, and I apologize, I'm not a great reader. I am dyslexic, but I was really excited to be a part of this, and I really want to do it. And I think it's great that this book will be available to people out there who aren't able to read it themselves for any number of reasons. So anyways, I want to assure you that I'm probably the worst reader working on this project. So if you make it through chapter 1 with me, the subsequent readers are probably going to be quite a bit more entertaining and fluid. So, but anyways, let me start with chapter 1, preliminaries and speculations. Here we go. The saying that man is what he eats derives and expanded significance from the theory that developed from apehood to humanity was caused by a change in diet. The school of scientists which believe that food made men of apes pictures a remote age when the climate of the world was so rainy that the forests were spread over most all of the tropics and subtropic lands of Europe, Asia, and Africa. In the humid forest lived many anthropoids, among them the gorilla, the orang, the chimpanzee, and the cousin of theirs from whom mankind is descended. They were all vegetarian, about to the extent that apes are now, meaning that they live principally on tubers, nuts, fruits, buds, and tender shoots. Like the present apes, they would catch and eat few small animals, living among the branches or at least able to climb a tree when in danger or in want of food which grew aloft. The ancestors of man flourished as long as woodland remained damp, hot, and substantially unbroken. But according to the hypothesis, there came a change in the old world climate such that areas here and there became too dry to support a forest and turned into prairie. This would not matter at first, while the glades were small. The forest population withdrew from or scampered across the patches of grassland. But if the change in climate was progressive and of continental scope, it would come to pass that islands of forest were surrounded by wide stretches of meadow and treeless plains. As the drying cycle progressed through centuries and millennia, the anthropoid tree dwellers would become more and more crowded in their limited asylums. As the forest island shrank, the prairie grew, and the living spaces of the grazing animals, horse and cow, antelope and sheep, which starve in woodlands but thrive in grasslands, expanded. The anthropoids as we see them today, and as we know them from remote ages through their teeth and their overall revealing bone formations, are vegetarians but not grazing animals. They cannot manage on timothy and bluegrass, but they can live on the flesh of grass eaters. The first men had to learn to hunt if they wanted to live. Like the anthropoids of today, our remote ancestors doubtless combined rudimentary hunting with gathering. They searched habitually for nests and ate the birdlings, as well as the eggs and the mother bird too, if they could catch her. The anthropoid manner of search for rodents and grubs combines hunting and gathering method. The theory pictures those of anthropoid which found themselves on the grasslands as facing a new environment with about the mental equipment of a chimpanzee, equal to that of a 4-year-old child. In the service of childlike brains, they had the most marvelous tools that nature ever gave an animal, a pair of hands. At first, the prairie-stranded anthropoids were chiefly gatherers, finding dead fish along a stream as a partly vegetarian grizzly bears do in Alaska, finding a ground squirrel in its burrow as the chiefly vegetarian grizzlies do in Arctic Canada, finding honey in bees' nests as the black bears do in New England, finding grubs in decaying trees as the native blackfellows do in Australia, gathering snails as the French do, digging clams as New Englanders do, bird nesting like the youngsters all over the world do, sucking eggs like Huck Finn, a modern chip. Of these habits, there would be gradual and natural expansion among the apes, who found themselves unable to discover a forest to which to gather what had been their main food, and was still their chief food, of their apes, cousins, and regions of more rain. Of these habits, there would be a gradual and natural expansion among the apes who found themselves unable to discover a forest in which to gather what had been their main food, and was still the chief food of their ape cousins in the regions of more rain. The prairie ape would have the ingenuity, as many other animals have, to lie motionless in the grass till some small grazing animal, perhaps a lamb or kid, came near enough to be seized. Troops of pre-humans would work together, as troops of baboons still do, for defense and offense. In short, as the theory holds, the apes found it necessary in the grasslands that swarmed with grazing animals to become ingenious in order to live, while the ancestors of the chimpanzee and the gorilla at home in the accustomed tropical forest required no more than apish industry and perseverance in the search for roots, shoots, and fruits. What had been good enough for their fathers was good enough for them, served them well in a familiar environment, and kept them what they were, anthropoids. On the grasslands, there was now in play a rigorous process of natural selection. Those apes that kept searching for tubers and fruits in a region that no longer contained many of them had less and less chance of survival as the islands of tree growth along the rivers or lakes became increasingly scarce, with a progressive change from a heavy forest to a uniform prairie. As the grasses spread to replace the trees, there was more and more food to support more and more antelope, sheep, horses, and buffalo, and thus more and more survival opportunities for those slowly evolving forebears of man whose brains guided their hands towards the use of clubs and throwing of stones, and finally the development of knife, spear, and bow. Chapter 1, page 4, paragraph 1. In this transition period, the death rate must have been heavy, not only among those slower of brain and lacking in ingenuity, but surely also throughout the prairie communities. There must have been serious trouble in adapting the old vegetarian digestive function to their new food. Just as it seems clear that the Iceland pony, which lives on fish, is not quite so well off as his hay-fed brother, there must have been new derangements, producing many an earthly death, and a dietetic lax, causing deficiencies and disease. All these things, if they happen, must have taken place millions of years or tens of millions of years before the present era. During the eons of time since then, the forest-dwelling anthropoids have changed little, so far as can be judged, from the preserved bones. In the same space, the near humans changed to humans so efficiently that some anthropologists assert that Cro-Magnon man of 20,000 or 30,000 years ago in France was in his physique, if anything, more ideally human than the present-day European, if humanness is measured in terms of difference from anthropoid. This book, although written by a part-time anthropologist, is not a work of anthropology. Although written by a part-time geographer, it is not a geographic treatise. So I do no more in this introductory chapter than touch upon the facts and theorizing that back up the view of man's origin upon which, as a peg, the 12 chapters that follow are hung. The anthropologists, through their archaeology, and the geologists, through their paleontology, find themselves in agreement that agriculture is a recent development in the evolution of man. For its existence is not provable in any part of the world more than 20,000 years back. Professor Ellsworth Huntington, distinguished authority on man's relation to land and climate, says in his Mainsprings of Civilization, published in 1945, that the first agriculture, which he thinks consisted merely in such operations as gathering and storing the kernels of self-sown grains, does not even in the primitive form go back further than the New Stone Age, thus much less than 20,000 years ago, perhaps only 10,000, and this, he thinks, will have been in some such countries as Egypt. He considers that those of us who are descended from northern Europeans have had agricultural forebears through only 2, 3, or 4,000 years. During the period before agriculture, it is chiefly in the tropics and not elsewhere there that men could, as some do at present, live like their anthropoid predecessors and cousins by digging roots, tubers, and collecting shoots, bulbs, fruits, nuts, and by catching a few small creatures. Outside the tropics, pre-farming man was necessarily in the main a hunter. Secondly, he was the gatherer of such animal foods as worms, grubs, and insects, including locusts, shellfish, and thrown up along the beach stranded seals and whales. He scouted around, no doubt, and competed with the hyena and the vulture for bodies of animals that had died of illness, accident, or old age. The necessarily almost complete dependence of pre-agricultural man on animal food is not confined to the grasslands of the world, tropic, temperate, or Arctic. It applies nearly as much to some temperate zones and most Arctic woodlands, even to many tropic forests. Carl Lumholtz reports, for instance, that when he was with the tropic forest-dwelling natives of North Australia, they lived mainly on animal food and never ate anything other than this. Necessarily almost complete dependence of pre-agricultural man on animal foods is not confined to the grasslands of the world, tropic, temperate, or Arctic. It applies nearly as much to some temperate zones and most Arctic woodlands, even to many tropic forests. Carl Lumholtz reports, for instance, that when he was with the tropical forest-dwelling natives of North Australia, they lived mainly on animal food and never ate anything of vegetal nature if flesh foods were available. So from the time when our ancestors ceased being ape-like gatherers of monkey food down to the substantial growth of agriculture, mankind lived through one or several million of years chiefly on the lean and fat of animals. The exception to this would be some groups which drift back into tropical and tropic forests of the humid type, which enable the chimpanzee and the gorilla to remain anthropoid. As I've said, there must have been a lot of digestive and other physical troubles when the anthropoid was changing to man through the rigors of natural selection in a country that had vegetation on which cattle flourished, but apes did not. The few who survived the grueling process to become the first men were, however, of necessity well adapted to the huntsman's diet, content with it and healthy on it. Else, they would not have survived. The sustainability of organs was natural, inherent by their descendants, or at least those of them who were healthy and thus successful, on the meat diet of the hunter, or on its slight modification, the meat and milk diet of the herdsman. There is, however, the fundamental drawback of living by means of hunting, that no small area can support a large population. This difficulty is mitigated rather than solved by the domestication of animals, which, for instance, enables a man both to ride a horse for hunting buffalo and also to eat the horse when it is not needed for further use as a mount. The basic difficulty with both hunting and herding is that, by varying estimates, something between 5 and 10 men can live on a given amount of what hogs eat for everyone who can live by eating the hogs. So there is a powerful economic pressure for returning to the food habits of our ape-like ancestors, with the modification that instead of hunting for things to dig from the ground or to pick off the trees, we till the ground for cereals and plant trees that bear fruit. Since we all have an urge to live, and since parents desire that their children shall not go hungry, the development of agriculture followed necessarily as soon as men found out that more of them could live on wheat from plowed soil than could possibly get along by hunting the animals that grazed over the same land. But there are few gains without pains, just as there must have been ill health and difficult adaptation when the ape man was changing from the diet of the gathering ape to that of the hunting man, so there would be similar trouble when people who had been hunters began to change gradually from nearly a quite exclusive flesh diet to one that contained more and more rice, wheat, and corn. The million or so years which had intervened since the ape turned into man had eliminated, by natural selection, those that were best suited for digesting vegetables, since they would have been least suited for digesting meat. Besides, the roots and the shoots diet of the ape man in the humid forest markedly different from that of the grain-fed farmer. A little rough, sorry. In this introductory chapter, I shall go deeply into the difficulties encountered by man in making the necessary adjustments when he turned, after ages of hunting and herding, to a diet which, although largely from vegetable kingdom, was nevertheless strikingly different from that of his pre-human ancestors, a diet not mainly of roots, shoots, nuts, and fruits, but of cereal. I rest with a quotation and paraphrase of a section from Professor Huntington's Mainspring of Civilization, in which he discusses the medley of advantages and troubles, some of them definitely known and the rest inferred, that came upon hunting man when he began to try to support large numbers of his kind on small areas through the cultivation of beans, lentils, rice, wheat, oats, and the rest of the cereal. In this chapter, Agriculture, Disease, and Diet, Huntington says, the ideal diet, it would seem, must be essentially that to which man becomes adjusted during his long, slow evolution. Among most of the ancestors of modern Europeans, Americans, an agricultural diet has prevailed less than 2,000 years. There is no reliable evidence that in that brief span of any appreciable change has occurred in the inherent dietary requirements, which had become established during a preceding period, perhaps 1,000 times longer ago. 1,000 times longer, sorry. Huntington then believes that 2 million years intervened between the time when early man, our pre-man, ceased depending mainly on the food of apes, and the time when, as an agriculturalist, he returned to a diet which, although similar to that of apes in containing a relatively small percentage of flesh foods, is unlikely any previous diet of an ape man or man in its high percentage of cereals. Huntington thinks it would appear that the change in diet brought on through the cultivation of fields introduces a reciprocal relation. For he believes that as agriculture raises the quantity, it also lowers the quality of food. The quality being judged by the healthfulness to men who have been living for 2 million years on something else, he says. And this is a quote from Huntington. The most important effect of agriculture on efficiency probably results from manipulation. One of the main reasons for poor nutrition is that agriculture has lowered the quality of man's diet, and at the same time made it possible for more people to subsist. Mechanical methods of preparing food has gone still further, although the same sad path, until the typical modernized diet has become appallingly poor. By modernized, we do not mean that the diet now eaten by more intellectual and prosperous people of Europe and America, but the kind that is still eaten by people at lower economic levels and in many other countries by the majority of the population. In such a diet, bread, cereal, potatoes, and other forms of starchy food play a dominant part. The rest is largely composed of vegetable protein, such as beans, together with carbohydrates in the form of sugar. Huntington summarizes, agriculture has been powerful factor in lowering human efficiency as well as in advancing civilization. Practically every step of progress is accompanied by drawbacks which are not rectified for a long time. Humanity may have needed most of Honeyman's 2 million years for evolving from the largely vegetarian habit of the anthropoid to where it can make the best use of the diet of a hunter. We should not feel discouraged. Then if it, in a mere 5 or 10,000 years of agriculture, we have as not yet grown fully reconciled biologically to the intrusion of large quantities of sugar, starches, vegetable proteins, and vegetable fats into a regime which had no longer consisted in the main of animal proteins and animal fats. Following the line of Weston Price in Nutrition and Physical Degeneration, Huntington believes that among the effects of transfer from previous diets to those of agriculturalists are the difficulties that the difficulties women have in childbirth, contrasted with the ease of this function among those who live in pre-agricultural type of life. Another effect is that the tendency for malformed jaws and bad teeth among grain-fed people. Imagine that. Okay. As to the ease of childbirth under pre-agricultural conditions, it seems to support Price's reasoning. But I shall not here analyze the evidence. Neither do I pursue further the question of whether the common recession of the jaw among the Japanese, which gives them physiognomy made to order for cartoonists. Sorry, Japanese people. Things were different back then. Is due to the large percentage of cereals in their food. Nor do I examine in detail the use of less of wisdom teeth among us caused by the shrinkage of the lower jaw to where there is not enough room left for them. This being allegedly a result of our large dependence on starch and sugar. I do, however, anticipate my chapter and visit your dentist twice a year to the extent to point out that Price and Huntington have many predecessors as well as followers who regard to the effect of starch and sugar on the teeth themselves. For instance, Henry B. Collins, Jr., director of the Wartime Ethnographic Board and the ethnologist of staff of the Smithsonian Institute, considers that if archaeologists discover anywhere a group of several skeletons, no matter what probable antiquity, they may be sure that if the teeth have cavities in them, signs of dental caries, then those are the skeletons of people who had lived under fairly well-developed agriculture. Particularly, the whole world is now agriculture in its diet. For even the Eskimos of parts like the north coast of Alaska have succumbed to our food fashion. There are left, however, a few places where men still use the diet that preceded agriculture. And we possess books of the last 300 years that tell a good tale of the lives of hunters and herders. It would seem then that the speculative study of our forebears has begun at the stage when they first deserve the name anthropoid, or ape human. Their dietary history will fall into three main stages: gathering, hunting, and farming. According to the geologists, the gathering stage, or ape man period, lasted several million years. During this time, man ate roots, tubers, shoots, succulent leaves, fruits, yams, nuts, worms, snails, rodents, eggs, and fledgling birds. This period was long enough for us to become well adapted to digesting and assimilating the diet to be healthy on it. We can be healthy on it now, as in demonstrated by those vegetarians like Bernard Shaw, who have money enough to buy these at present rather costly foods. The deficiency group of diseases, malformed bones, difficulty in childbirth, they seemingly do not trouble those humid forest natives and those high-income vegetarians who can manage to get enough of the sort of food on which monkeys do well. So apparently, Stefansson saw some people who were some sort of vegetarian in his day and age that could get by on it. After the largely vegetarian gathering stage came the hunting stage, during which the ape turned definitely human. This will have lasted between 1 and 3 million years. The period is long enough to be able to digest and assimilation to adapt to those themselves to a large carnivorous diet. To judge from present knowledge of so-called savages, the food of the hunting period ranged from the entirely carnivorous inlands where grass was plenty and humid forests rare or absent to a partly carnivorous regime in places where it was convenient to supplement the flesh diet with a certain amount of monkey food. So far as can now be known, those men who during this stage lived wholly on their new diet, that of hunters, and those who supplemented the new with the old, were in equally good health. In both cases, the deficiency group of disease was absent, certainly from the exclusive carnivorous and probably from those who combined the methods of gathering and hunting. The pastoral way of life does not constitute a separate stage in the history of the human diet. For as we have pointed out, the change was not fundamental. It was only the substitution of milk for blood as an element in the diet, or rather the supplementing of the blood part with milk part, the milk being a slightly modified form of blood. The third, or agricultural stage of diet marks a profound change from either of the two previous diets. those of the gathering ape and of the hunting or herding man. For hitherto an exclusive gatherers in the anthropoid stage, and as occasional gatherers in the hunting stage, men cannot have had a high percentage of cereal food. A little gathering of the wild rice or wild wheat now and then by some groups have and there cannot have given the people of 10 or 20,000 years ago much evolutionary preparation for the drastic change that came in when our recent ancestors in some such place like Egypt, India, and China discovered they could support great numbers on a small area by planting crops, which in practice were chiefly cereals, at least over great stretches of several continents. 10 or even 20,000 years is a short spell in which terms of biological evolution. Such the human mechanism for digesting and assimilating may still be much like what it was when agriculture was thrust upon the human race, a change in diet that was nearly as profound as the one which had been forced on anthropoid long ago when he faced the choice of hunting or perishing. I have suggested that there must have been a cycle of malnutrition, discomfort, and early deaths that lasted many tens of thousands of years, while the mechanisms of the body handling monkey food was being adapted to handling considerable and at lengthy, very high percentages of flesh food. It is doubtful that mankind is as yet through biologically with the worst of the corresponding period of change from the human and pastoral to the hunting and pastoral to the agricultural way of life. Much has been printed in the general state of the public health in the Americas and Europe, and it at any rate can be judged absolutely. Relatively, we are not so clear on the facts and views. Those of us who read the newspapers and supplement with books and medicine and dietetics and physiology. It is particularly anthropologists alone, that's the students of prehistory and of the modern primitive, who seem aware that broad conditions of health influenced by food were ever fundamentally different from that they now are. For most branches of science which deal with health never have been jolted from a nearly unquestioning acceptance of the predominantly agricultural civilizations into which we were born and in which we and our neighbors and nearly all people we ever heard of have lived. On the agricultural diets now taken for granted, this nation, like most of all civilized nations, is having a deal of trouble with manipulation. Except among those who can afford a lot of hunting man's food, like beef, steak, chicken, or a lot of monkey food, like fresh fruit and raw vegetables accepted. For these fortunes, we suffer on our usual diets with endemic deficiency troubles. Among them, pellagra, beriberi, scurvy, rickets, contracted lower jaws, and poor teeth. Even the prosperous among us do not quite escape, for not all their forethought and care will prevent such records as of 95% incident of tooth decay in high school seniors of a fashionable suburb, and a 98% decay ratio for the senior class of any college. Things like dental caries and rickets are the commonplace of the only way of life known to most of us, whether by trial or by vivid hearsay. Such troubles have been with us since agriculture began. Thus, from prehistoric times, most of us conceive of nothing different, take as inevitable as the common lot of man, the pains and derangements which we suppose to have been universal at all times and in all places. If we discuss general health problems, it is usually with regard to detail, perhaps whether the caries incidence among high school seniors is 95% or only 90%, and whether some way could not be found to reduce it by 5 or 10%. No one thinks that decay ratios being reduced to anything like so percent, and certainly no one would talk of reducing it to zero, at least unless some revolutionary discovery were to be made. However, we are accustomed to comparing the results of change in diet and discussing the health consequences of various dietary systems. Much has been published, for instance, about the question of health that involve comparisons between agricultural diets and those vegetarian regimes which are of the monkey food type. Green vegetables, yellow vegetables, nuts, fruits, sprouts, shoots, roots, and the juices of fruits and vegetables. Bernard Shaw has been along this line in education in himself. Thus, we are posted on comparing the foods of our pre-human ancestors with those of farming man. In contrast, relatively little that has been printed is available for comparison of diets of agricultural man. and with those of the hunters whose lives span millions of years, so between ape and farmer. The comparative lack started me 20 years ago, gathering material for what I hoped would be a substantial contribution to a relatively neglected branch of knowledge. The result of the study were to be described in a series of books which would carry the overall title, The Lives of Hunters. Of that work, the volume, Not by Bread Alone, is the first installment. In it, as in the rest of the study, I draw upon my training as an anthropologist and my experience of living exclusively on meat among exclusive meat eaters, and a full-time study of books and of other records that deal with hunting and pastoral man. I draw, too, upon manuscripts and verbal contributions from numerous personal friends, scientific colleagues among explorers, geographers, anthropologists, and physiologists. In this introductory volume, but naturally more so in the work of as a whole, I am trying to furnish material for a sounder comparison that has hitherto been practicable between our lives as agricultural people and the lives of those others whom I have known directly or vicariously and who still live by hunting, much as our forefathers presumably did through the rather considerable stretch of time. Whether it be 2 million or only 200,000 years from this period when the ancestors and their ancestors and ours became human to the time when the ancestors of some of us became farmers. That is the end of chapter 1 of FotL Land. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed the rest of the book. There's many more chapters to come, and hopefully this won't be the last book. But anyways, it's an eye-opening book for a lot of us, and I'm happy to be part of a group of people that are going to try and share it with more people. So, and everybody out there, eat a little meat and feel better.